London, 1872. It was a dark and cloudy day. The candles dimly lit the room where Mr. George Smith was working. He had been hired by the British Museum to crack an ancient mystery, trying to decrypt some clay tablets written in Akkadian, a language that was poorly understood at the time. He squinted his eyes and scratched his head. "Come on, it can't be," he murmured. Mr. Smith had just discovered the first historical account of the Deluge myth. The text was part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale that had been forgotten for 2,000 years. What is this story about, and why does it matter?
This story is one of humanity's earliest works of poetry and literature. But that's not all. It matters because it's an epic story about the fear of death, and it contains some universal themes that still resonate in our time. It talks about the eternal struggle of nature versus nurture, but it's also about wisdom, abuse of power, adventure, love, friendship, and understanding one's own limits. And there are zombies. Yes, I mean ancient Mesopotamian zombies. Come on, this is really cool.
At the beginning of the story, Gilgamesh is presented as the supreme ruler of Uruk, a very important city of Mesopotamia. He was a tyrant to his subjects, a lecherous predator of young girls, and a prolific employer of forced labor. His tyranny grew day by day. Yet no one could beat him, for Gilgamesh was a demigod. The people of Uruk were tired of his rule, and they asked the gods to deal with him. Their lamentations were heard by Auru, who was the goddess of fertility. She made a creature named Enkidu out of water and clay. Enkidu was half man, half bull. He was created in the wildlands, far from civilization. He was grazing with a herd of gazelles when a hunter spotted him, but he was too afraid to come closer. The hunter was upset, as Enkidu helped the animals to avoid his traps. So the hunter asked his king for assistance. He told Gilgamesh about this strange man of the wild, and a plan was devised back in Uruk. There was a temple prostitute named Shamhat, and the king ordered her to follow the hunter and seduce Enkidu. When Enkidu saw Shamhat, he, showed some interest in her. And for 1 week the two were... Come on, this is a family-rated channel. Let's just say they had a relation.
Shamhat's love made Enkidu forget his wild origins. He stood up and his gazelle herd didn't recognize him anymore. So Shamhat took Enkidu to a shepherd camp, and there he learned how to eat bread and drink ale. Slowly he became more and more civilized, and he groomed his long wild hairs. Meanwhile, one night strange dreams appeared to Gilgamesh, and he learned of the arrival of a new companion. Maybe this new friend was going to be the half-beast of the wilds.
In the shepherd's camp, Enkidu heard a lot of stories about Uruk and its tyrant king. He learned that Gilgamesh frequently used the Lord's right to bed any bride-to-be he damned well pleased, just like in the movie Braveheart. Enkidu was furious about Gilgamesh's abuses, and so he stormed the city of Uruk, ready to stop the tyrant. A wedding was being celebrated, and when Gilgamesh showed up to take advantage of his royal right, he found a nasty surprise. Enkidu was hiding in the bedroom and he was ready to stop the king. Immediately a fight ensued. The two mighty warriors grappled with each other. The fight made the walls shake like an earthquake. Finally, Gilgamesh had found a worthy opponent. But in the end, Enkidu was forced to recognize that Gilgamesh was a superior fighter to him. The king noticed the wild man's strength and understood Enkidu was the prophesied companion. The two quickly became friends, and Gilgamesh proposed that they should undertake a journey. This was probably an unrealized dream of Gilgamesh, and Enkidu was undoubtedly the companion of choice. Gilgamesh envisioned a great adventure to the cedar forest. Today we call it Lebanon. In a harsh environment like Mesopotamia, timber was a scarce and very valuable resource. The mighty Lebanese cedars had to appear to be from another world. Just one problem. The cedar forest had a fierce guardian known as Humbaba. Enkidu was scared of this great monster, and the Council of Elders tried to stop the king from going because Humbaba's voice is the deluge, his speech is fire, his breath is death. But Gilgamesh wanted to be renowned as the greatest king of all time, and he was determined to slay Humbaba. In the end, he placated the Elder Council and convinced Enkidu to join him. They prepared for their adventure like any responsible party of adventurers would, and bronze axes and swords were cast for them.
They went to the palace of Ninsun, the sun goddess, who was Gilgamesh's mother. As soon as Ninsun saw him, she adopted Enkidu as her own son, making the king and the wild man brothers. Ninsun then promised them to watch over Uruk in their absence, and that she would ask the other gods for help.
Eventually, they started a long journey to the west. Every third day, they stopped, made camp and performed some rituals to provoke a divine dream. But each time, Gilgamesh had a nightmare. He saw falling mountains, thunderstorms, and fire. Exactly what was associated with the mighty Humbaba. Enkidu saw these dreams as a good omen. Each time, he told Gilgamesh, the dreams meant they were going to slay the monster. Finally, after a long trek, they reached the cedar forest. Weapons in their hands, they crept through Humbaba's realm. The great monster was lurking and was ready to ambush the two companions. When he saw fit, he attacked the two. They had the protection of the goddess Ninsun, however. She pleaded to the sun god to send all the winds to blind the guardian of the forest. The king of Uruk took advantage of this divine intervention, lunged forward and wounded Humbaba. The guardian of the forest prostrated himself and begged for mercy. He proposed to become Gilgamesh's slave and to guard the forest for him. But Enkidu prompted his friend to slay the monster and thus establish his reputation as a mighty warrior. So, Gilgamesh raised his blade, cut off Humbaba's head, and stored it in a leather bag. An image that was later used by the Greeks for the myth of Medusa.
Gilgamesh was now master of the cedar forest, and he and his friend started to fell the huge cedar trees. The king had a great plan in mind: to build a huge door for the temple of the storm god himself, probably in order to appease his wrath for having slain Humbaba, as the monster was under the god's protection.
The two companions built a raft that they loaded with the timber and Humbaba's head, and so embarked upon the long journey back home. Home, at last. They threw away their dirty clothes, and when Gilgamesh put his crown back on his head, Ishtar appeared to him. She was the goddess of both love and war. Ishtar proposed to the king, promising great power if he married her. But Gilgamesh refused this proposal, given that Ishtar's previous lovers all met a bad end. Ishtar was furious about Gilgamesh's refusal, so she asked her divine parents to lend her the Bull of Heaven, a mighty creature that she wanted to use to kill the king of Uruk. And if they refused her request, well, in that case, she made a threat. She would tear down the doors of the netherworld and flood the world with an undead army. And so the Bull of Heaven was given to Ishtar, so she could attack Uruk and kill Gilgamesh. The bull was so powerful that his snort opened cracks in the ground. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu quickly engaged it. Enkidu jumped forward and grabbed the bull by its horns. The mighty creature tried to fight back, but Gilgamesh quickly thrust his blade into the bull's head. The two warriors had beheaded Humbaba and killed the Bull of Heaven too. They were making such a mess. So the gods decided one of the two had to die. They agreed on killing Enkidu and sparing Gilgamesh's life. So Enkidu fell ill. On his sickbed, he cursed the door made of cedar. He cursed the prostitute and the hunter who removed him from the wild. And with this, he died.
Gilgamesh prepared a great funeral for his friend. A statue was carved, and all forests, mountains, fields, rivers and beasts were called upon to mourn the death of the great wild man. Then, after a funerary banquet, a river was dammed and Enkidu was buried under the river's bed. This is a powerful image. The river represents the forces of nature and chaos, in some ways the origin of Enkidu. Damming a river meant control over nature, as Enkidu had done, but eventually nature and chaos prevailed once again.
Enkidu's death terrified Gilgamesh. The once bold king who used to seek adventure and fame now realized his own mortality. He had understood what grief and sorrow were, and he was afraid for his own life. He started roaming the wildlands wearing only the hides of animals he hunted. In some way, the saddle wall that divided civilization and order from wilderness and chaos had been turned down. Gilgamesh now had one goal: to find a man named Utnapishtim, who was known to be the only immortal man. He wanted to learn his secret and avoid death. So began a long and dangerous journey toward the end of Earth where Utnapishtim lived. The steppes were a dangerous place. He was attacked by wild lions, but incredibly slew them all. When he reached the ends of the earth, he encountered two scorpion men. They were guarding the passage to the Garden of the Gods. But Gilgamesh managed to convince them to grant him safe passage. So he walked into the dark tunnel of the mountain, finally reaching an otherworldly land. In this place resided Shiduri, a tavern keeper who lived by the seashore. When she saw Gilgamesh approaching her house, she was scared because, after his long journey, the mighty king now looked like an outlaw. Nevertheless, he was able to convince her about his good intentions. But Shiduri the tavern keeper told him that it was impossible to reach the place where Utnapishtim lived. In fact, he dwelt across the sea known as the Waters of Death. there was only one man who could help him, a boatman known as Ushanadi. Chidori tried to persuade the king to stop his quest. He should have been happy to live a simple domestic life, to be dressed in clean clothes and to take warm baths. But Gilgamesh was bound to complete his quest and to find the secret of immortality. So he found Ushanadi the boatman, and the two crossed the waters of death, what the later Greek tradition will call the Styx, a watery body that divides Earth and the underworld. Initially, they used long poles to propel the ship, but the waters were so dangerous they had to discard the poles after just one use. This is why Gilgamesh had to provide hundreds of them. But eventually they had used all their poles and hadn't reached their destination. So Gilgamesh took a big piece of fabric and created the first sail to cross the sea. Finally, Gilgamesh had reached the land where the immortal man Utnapishtim lived.
Here he met the ancient man and recalled his story and how Enkidu died. The king of Uruk then asked him for help because he wanted to put an end to his fear of death. After hearing Gilgamesh's story, Utnapishtim reprimanded him, saying he was a great king, but he was acting like a fool. He was wasting his time with an impossible goal. And while a fool is not really responsible for his actions, the great king has advisors on his side, and they can guide him if so bothered.
Utnapishtim's answer is one of the most important parts of the entire epic of Gilgamesh. It states clearly what the duties of a king are. He must not waste his power on senseless quests. Utnapishtim explains that death comes and takes men away, and yet life goes on, generation after generation in a never-ending cycle. Real immortality is not that of the king or a single individual. Real immortality belongs to humanity as a whole. But Gilgamesh had not traveled so far to hear such words. He wanted to know why Utnapishtim was immortal and what his secret was. So Utnapishtim finally told him his story. The gods decided to send a great flood to wipe away humanity. But one of the gods leaked the plan and told Utnapishtim to build a giant boat and save himself from the deluge. Then the flood came, and Utnapishtim was safe in his boat, but the whole world was underwater. Like Noah and his ark, he didn't have a place to dock, so he released 3 birds. The first 2 came back because they hadn't found the shore, but the last one landed away, signaling that the water was retreating. The gods discovered that Utnapishtim had survived, and they removed him from Mesopotamia, placing him in a faraway land beyond the waters of death.
So this is how he became immortal. It was a one-time solution to a very specific problem. Unfortunately, that meant Gilgamesh could never achieve immortality. But the ancient man had advice for the king. Perhaps he could try to beat sleep instead of beating death. Gilgamesh tried for a week, but in the end he was forced to admit his own mortal limits.
In the end, the immortal man gave the king fresh clothes and a place to clean himself. This was exactly what Chidori the tavern keeper told the king what a happy life was about. To be clean, to be well dressed, to have a simple life. Gilgamesh had been defeated, and it was time to go home. When the king of Uruk was about to embark for their journey home, Utnapishtim had one last secret to reveal. Under the Apsu, the sacred underground ocean, there was a rejuvenation plant. whoever eats it gains eternal youth. So maybe that could be enough for the king who was seeking immortality. Very quickly, Gilgamesh put some stone weights on his legs and jumped into the water. He explored the bottom of the underground ocean and retrieved the plant. This episode probably refers to corals harvesting and to the submarine freshwater wells one can find in Bahrain, an island not too far from Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh had completed his quest, and he was ready to return to Uruk. But while he and Urshanabi were relaxing in a pool, something happened on the way back home. A cunning snake snatched the magical plant, and it became young again, discarding its old skin. In the end, Gilgamesh had been beaten again. For him there was no way to immortality nor towards eternal youth. The limits of the human condition had become clear to him. This revelation made him weary and sad on his way back to Uruk. But when Gilgamesh approached Uruk, he finally understood that his quest was not a failure. He asked Urshanabi to climb on the walls of his city and take a look. The great king who had sought a way to avoid death could now see the truth. It was useless to seek eternal life for himself.
The city, its people and its civilization were his own true immortal legacy. Utnapishtim had been right all the time. The real immortality is not one of the king or of a single individual. The real immortality belongs to humanity as a whole.